welcome to our workshop on climate justice in the Global South. I'm really happy that you could make time for us and speak about the law, lawyers, and environmental problems. Professor Malcolm is an environmental lawyer who specializes in looking at the way that the law can be used to protect the environment. She is the director of the Environmental Regulatory Research Group at the University of Surrey, and she's chair of the Special Interest Group on Plastics and the Environment. More recently, Rosalind has been working on the wicked problem of polluting waste from plastics and how a circular economy might help to stop the problem of waste. So she looks at laws around eco-design of products and how they can be implemented to stop the production of waste and pollution. And she's undertaken this work not just in the UK, but she has advised policymakers at the European Union, and she has undertaken this work in a range of African countries. Rosalind has also worked on the right to water and sanitation and how this can be used to ensure a decent standard of living for people, especially in developing countries. I've worked alongside Rosalind since 2009. She gave me my first permanent academic post. Is my mentor in environmental law in many, many ways. And it is my privilege and honor to welcome her to this workshop. Rosalind, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tucker, for that lovely introduction, and I'm very proud of you too. So thank you to everybody for coming, and I have a few slides, and I think I can share my screen. So I'm going to do that first of all. See if that works. No, is that working? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So if I can turn that into a slideshow for you. Okay, now, as Toko has explained, he asked me to give a talk on law, lawyers and environmental problems. And so I took that as quite a bit of liberty to talk about a variety of things and much of my work and how that can be used in the context of climate change. So I'm going to talk about why we need lawyers when resolving environmental problems. I do quite a lot of research projects where I work alongside other disciplines, and I've always advocated that lawyers should always be part of those groupings, those research groupings, those advisory groups and committees and so on, because we are responsible for the end result, for the enforcement of the new technique, the new approach, the new process, whatever the subject might be of the project, but you need to wrap into that the manner in which it's going to be enforced. And very often, you know, to my great sadness, people talk about law as being a barrier. And I have always argued that we need to view, you know, we as lawyers, as environmental lawyers, need to view law as the driver. We need to get rid of this notion of law as a barrier. We need to use it. We need to use it effectively. So we need lawyers involved in these different problems. So I'll talk a bit more about that. I will give you my personal perspective, if you'll forgive me. I'm going to indulge myself a little bit and talk about my work and how I've sought to do exactly what I've just been talking about, integrating the work of lawyers, the role of law into the resolution of problems. And I will seek to show how that's relevant to law and lawyers working within the field of climate change in the Global South. I never consider myself a climate change lawyer. I'm an environmental lawyer. I work across the whole spectrum of different problems in environmental media. But of course, that comes under this enormous umbrella of climate change. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, so you can see the nature of the work that I do and how I seek to involve law. I am co-director, and I think my co-director, Dr. Noreen O'Mara, is with us today as well, for the Surrey Centre for International and Environmental Law. And my research grouping, the Environmental Regulatory Research Group, is part of that centre, which sits within the School of Law here in Surrey. I run, co-direct a governing plastics network. That's one of my current projects. And you will be hearing from the other co-director, my co-director, Professor Rosalind later this afternoon, I think. So he may well talk to you a little bit more about it. But I'm going to use my talk to demonstrate how that is part of the whole problem of dealing with law and environmental problems. And then, in addition to my academic role, my research role, I do advice and consultancy as a practicing barrister through my local set of barristers' chambers in Guildford, which is where I am today, in not a not very sunny Guildford today, despite the photograph behind me. So, climate change law, and I put a question mark there because we talk about climate change law, and we think of it in the context of, well, the talks that you've just been having, the institutional structures, the different approaches, the integration of human rights into it. But the truth is that it's not about just one thing. You could say, the climate change problem is about reducing the world temperature by 1.5 or 2 degrees, that is the problem, and the law is focused on that one thing. But the truth of the matter is, it's not just about that one thing where the law is relevant. You've got to think about all the activities that we as human beings on this planet undertake, which create that problem for climate change. And so it's about the food we eat, the way we grow our food. So looking at different kinds of production where we might be looking to soy to replace different types of foods. The way we grow that, the nature of the food, all has its implications in terms of the emissions that are made. The stuff we buy. We are tremendous consumers in all parts of the world. I think that the developed world, the Western world, or the global North, whatever we call it, is the great culprit in this. But of course, this is a human addiction that I think affects the whole world. This desire to have things, to own things, to possess things, to have the latest thing as well, not just to have the thing that we buy that lasts us a lifetime, but that we are seduced so easily into buying that new product, that new piece of electronic equipment. I could ask you at this point, which mobile phone are you on? How many of you had? Is there anybody still on their first mobile phone? Very unlikely. Even I have been persuaded to give up my beloved Nokia phone, which was a mobile phone that actually made phone calls and little else, to go from the smartphone, which of course is the small computer that we all want. But I'm only on number 2, so I have a certain amount of credit here, I think. But I guess many of you are going to be on your 3rd, 4th, 5th, even 6th mobile phones. And you have to ask, was it that much better than the first or the second one that I had? This weakness that we have as a species for stuff, the whole consumerism thing, is part of the climate change problem. And then, of course, following on from that, what we throw away, this enormous waste problem that we generate. We make the stuff, we have factories, we dig it out of the ground. All these activities are part of climate change. And all these activities require legal involvement. It requires the law to operate as a barrier to these activities that damage the planet and create climate change. So it's not just about the one thing, about reducing the temperature, it's about a whole variety of different things that are our way of life. And then perhaps if I can move the conversation to a question of what do we want? You know, how do we value life? Our lives, human beings, the rest of the world of living things on this planet. What do we want to do? How are we going to value that? And how are we going to achieve a planet that will survive for generations to come, and species that will survive? And in that, you have to ask the question about what makes us happy. And there are ethical questions, there are philosophical questions that we need to grapple with, that will drive these changes in the law which we need to achieve in order to protect the planet. And I've got a small clip here where we have, many of you may be familiar with an English guru called Sir David Attenborough. And he's been a great leader of late in terms of the way that we need to approach life. And if I can succeed in doing this, I'm just going to play a clip. If not, if I can't succeed, you have the clip here. It's just 2 minutes, where he's interviewed about some of those philosophical questions.
Ordinary people worldwide are beginning to realize that greed does not actually lead to joy.
What is your cautiously optimistic view of what the future is going to look like for us?
To be sober and as truthful as you can. It's not going to be paradise immediately. I think that the standard of living of the Western culture, civilized countries, is going to have to take pause. I think we are going to have to live more economically than we do. And we can do that. I believe that we will do it more happily, not less happily. And that the excesses that the capitalist system has brought us have got to be curbed somehow. That doesn't mean to say that capitalism is dead, and I'm not an economist, I don't know. But I believe that the nations of the world, and ordinary people worldwide, are beginning to realize that greed does not actually lead to joy.
Do you think it all boils down to our economic system, prioritizing infinite growth?
Indeed so. I mean, our economic system has been based on the profit principle, that you have to come out at the end of the year having made a profit, and the bigger profit you can make, the better it is. And in the short term, that works, but then it ends with disaster. So that you have to, at last, have the wisdom to realize that you can live sustainably, that it is possible that your economics could work on a rather different system from the one which is based on profit.
What would you really want to convey from everything you continue to learn and experience when it comes to making a real tangible difference in this world to secure a better, brighter future for all?
I don't know. Except that I do know that if you help the natural world, the world becomes a better place for everybody.
I'm just going to cut him short there. You can watch the rest of that if you wish to. If I can get back to my PowerPoint slides now. Here we go. And I present that clip to you in part of that quest for how do we use the law to make the world a better place? How do we use it to make us happy, to make the planet happy, to value it? Circular economy questions. This is an area, as Toko mentioned earlier, in which I'm undertaking research, looking at the way in which our economy works. And we saw Sir David Attenborough talking about the problems of the economic system. And I'm not here to talk about, you know, the type of economy that we operate, but the way in which we use the stock and flow of products through that economy, where we need to reduce waste to as little as possible. I avoid the term zero waste. It's thermodynamically impossible, according to my colleagues in chemical engineering, to eliminate waste completely, but to reduce waste to as little as possible. And to reuse stuff, that stuff that we want to buy, that we need to think about reusing it. And I deliberately use the term reusing rather than recycling. Recycling has its own impacts on the environment. It has its own emissions. It makes its own contribution to climate change. So we need to think about this waste hierarchy more carefully. Energy from waste is often talked about as a way of using our waste usefully. And indeed, it's better than putting it in landfill, but it isn't the answer. Once you've burnt the product, once it's been converted into energy, it's lost forever. It's not a circular economy. It drops out of the economy. We've lost those resources that we dug up, mined or quarried, and we've thrown them away. It's a once only use at that point. It's a linear end of economy. And we need to think about how we can drive the law, use the law to drive an economy that keeps these resources in the environment, that stops depleting our environment and contributing to climate change. And of course, the solution, a solution, is never let it become waste in the first place. Let's get rid of the concept of waste. Let's think of everything as a reusable, useful item and use the law to drive that. Upcycling, not downcycling. Make something better all the time. Don't throw it away. Don't reduce it to burning as a downcycled use. I had a misspent youth. That's not quite as naughty as it might sound, because it involved me reading lots and lots of science fiction. And I carried with me this the idea in this book. And if you've got some spare time in your busy schedules, it's still worth reading, I think. The mote in God's eye, you will know from your study of the Bible that, of course, it's a biblical allusion. To remove the moting is the objective of the exercise. But in this science fiction story, there's an alien species, the motes, as the humans call them. And they have this amazing capacity to keep rebuilding things. And they smuggle on board the human spacecraft. And unbeknown to the human beings, they can't help themselves improving things. They improve the shields, the defense equipment, but they even improve the coffee percolator. So the humans find that they are getting better coffee. We need to become motes in that sense. We need to think about how we can improve the things that we have rather than throwing the things away and starting again all the time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that I'm working on with my colleagues here at the University of Surrey and the University of Nairobi. The problem of plastics waste, and we call it a wicked problem because it's a problem just like climate change, and it's part of the climate change problem that has so many aspects to it, so many multidisciplinary approaches to it, that we have to think about it in terms of, in a multi-directional way. You know, we have to look at different solutions, different ways in which we can solve the problem. That's a wicked problem. And here, I won't take time this morning playing it, but you have a link to yet another clip from Sir David Attenborough. And I mentioned this program that he produced, Blue Planet 2, which had a tremendous impact on the way in which people here in my country think about plastics, or at least before the pandemic were thinking about plastics. So I recommend you to at least watch the clip. Certainly the whole program is a wonderfully enjoyable thing and makes you realize why we should be valuing our planet. The particular clip here was based on evidence produced from Roland Geyer, former colleague here at the University of Surrey. And he did this work where he looked at the amount of plastics in the oceans, 8 million tons. That's a figure I think that is trotted out quite regularly around the world now. And it's from this particular paper that figure arises. So I quote here to you as lawyers, the source of the information on which we based our research problems and our work on governance and so on, taken from a Science Advances paper. And we look at the a variety of research questions. We've set up a governing plastics network. We have 3 different projects operating under that network now, funded by UK Research and Innovation and the University's Global Partnership Network. And we are working with 6 different African countries under 2 of the projects. And on the 3rd project, we're working with universities in Australia and Brazil at the problem of how to manage plastics. So it's about governance of plastics, the messages that are given, how we can deal with this problem of plastics waste. So we're looking at ways in which the law can be the driver, how it can turn off the tap in terms of plastics waste. We've got 8 million tonnes in the ocean, and that's got to be cleaned up. But our primary concern with these research projects is to look at the way in which we can turn off the tap for future waste. The problem is out there. Others are going to have to deal with that problem. But it seems really that the critical thing is to think, how do we stop more of it becoming waste, ending up in landfill and in the oceans? So the research questions that we'll look at broadly cover areas like, how do you stop plastic products becoming waste? How do you stop plastics being used once and thrown away? And many African countries, I think there are over 30 African, 19 African countries that have bans on single-use plastics and bans on the use of plastic bags, way ahead of the global north. In fact, we are going very slowly down this road where we can see major advances being made in legal systems in African countries about bans on single-use plastics. We agonize about these things because in the global north, because the whole dominance of the economic question tends to knock out the environment every time, a very dangerous thing for us to do, and touched on in that clip I showed you from David Attenborough. And we're looking at how to make plastic products designed so they last forever. I put that in quotes. I suppose nothing lasts forever, does it? But the notion that we will have very short-term uses needs to disappear, that we will go back perhaps to an earlier time where we made things to last, and not to last when they're waste, which is what plastic does at the moment, but to last as a product, whether we improve it, upcycle it at some point, but to stop it dropping out of the economy. And then one of our projects is particularly looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and to stop policy being knocked sideways by pandemics. We've seen the whole concentration, the concern, the dominant issue about plastics disappearing the moment that our health is at risk, our lives are at risk. Human beings always trump everything else. And we need to ensure that while that happens, if it happens in the future, if we look to future pandemics, how we can stop policy being knocked out in favor of pandemics. And we're all aware of the way that PPE, personal protective equipment, plastic very often is being used in the pandemic and being wasted, being lost from the economy. And we're looking at whose law works best to achieve that, how we can take the best, use it, and spread the word about these things. And as I said earlier, a wicked problem requires a multidisciplinary approach. So I've, within these projects, and Toko mentioned some other projects that he and I have worked on in the past, Right to Water, Right to Sanitation. We've always adopted the multidisciplinary approach, working with psychologists, business folk, economists, ecology specialists, chemical engineers, hydrology when we're doing water and sanitation, soil scientists, and of course lawyers. We need to take a team approach. We need to work alongside other disciplines, understand what they're saying to us, and make sure that what we say to them is understandable about how we can use the law to achieve solutions to these problems. So you may be asking, well, like the man asked, not what you can do for me, but what can I do for the world? What can I do for the planet? So my personal perspective here, research, for example, the Governing Plastics Network, as I've mentioned earlier, undertaking research, sitting alongside other disciplines in that context. Analysing governance structures. Much of the work that I do looks at governance systems and governance frameworks and says, why are they working or why are they not working? What is the problem with these structures? And very often, I mean, as I mentioned to you earlier, I don't describe myself as a climate change lawyer, and I don't view myself as an international lawyer. What I do is go into national legal systems and look at the laws within the country in which I'm working and see, first of all, you know, top down, what does the Constitution say? Does the Constitution establish certain rights? What does the national legislation say? Does it build in issues about managing waste, managing plastics, designing products, dealing with water and sanitation, all these various problems? How does it sit within the national legal systems? And then going down, looking at municipal legislation, bylaws, delegated legislation. How is it working in the city in which I'm working or the rural district in which I'm working? How are the laws playing out in that sense? And then looking at what's happening on the ground. And very often you find that actually the legal structure is beautiful, the laws are beautiful, that you really can't do a lot more to improve the way that the laws are looking. Obviously, they can be, there can always be room for improvement, but it's often not at that level that we find that there is a failing. What we find is the gap between the law and what's happening on the ground, that they are not being enforced. And so very often it's at that level that my work interfaces with the environmental problem, looking at the issues about enforcement. If you have a right to sanitation, how come that these 2.4 billion people don't have access to sanitation? You know, there's the right, there's the international human right, and you can often find it in constitutions and so on. How is it that that is not translating into a toilet for people? How is it that we're looking at laws on waste, that you have waste mountains? How come we've got 8 million tons of plastic waste in the ocean when pretty much all the laws of our countries say that we must manage our waste effectively and it's a criminal offence if we don't? And the failing is at that enforcement level. Much of my work, therefore, has come to bear at that gap between the law and enforcement of the law. So you can litigate. You may become, those of you who are students in the group, may become litigators in the future. You may look to bring actions to sue or to prosecute for environmental problems, to take the right to sanitation, as in the recent case in Kenya, where an ordinary individual brought through his lawyer, brought an action for failure for to have toilets on the highways, and said there is an international human right to sanitation. Where are the toilets on the highways? And won his case. So litigation can bring about change. Organisations like Client Earth, I will make my slides available afterwards, and you've got links on all these so you can delve further. Client Earth is a group of activist lawyers, and they operate worldwide, and this is their statement about forcing businesses and governments to deliver on their obligations, to help draft laws and to propose scientifically sound policies and solutions. So through litigation, a group of activists like the Client Earth lawyers can bring real change. And with homage to German courts, the Volkswagen scandal, I guess many of you will be aware of the way in which the car manufacturers, I think actually it's not confined to Volkswagen, but have used cheat emissions to cheat the atmospheric pollution laws. We have excellent laws on atmospheric emissions, but if you put a cheat device in a car, you can cheat the law. And here we have litigation that is bringing action in relation to that. So litigate, becoming a practicing lawyer, an activist lawyer. Negotiations, we've got a lot, here in the UK, we are finding ourselves in a whole new political structure, looking to negotiate free trade deals with the rest of the world. And absolutely critical in negotiating, and it's a skill lawyers have, we're trained negotiators, is to ensure that the environment is not forgotten. Much of my work when I teach, it's about pointing out that conflict between trade and the environment. Trade, all that stuff that we want and buy and throw away. Where do we want freedom of trade, we want an economy where people have jobs, but how do we make sure the environment isn't lost, isn't forgotten in that rush to buy stuff? We can consult and advise. So, you can write reports for governments. There's a report I wrote with Professor Klaus Tonner and looking at eco-design for products, writing reports for governments. Educate, which I hope we're doing today. You can write and talk about your work, and train people, train project managers and enforcement officers. And I think this is one of the key areas for us as lawyers. There are the laws, and then there are the people that carry out the laws. And we need to make sure that we train people who are actually doing the job. The project managers, the enforcement officers. For example, Toko and I did a project on humanitarian demining. And as a result of that project, we looked at a number of ways in which demining companies go into regions around the world and how they might impact on local laws, etc. So we wrote a very simple book. This is not a book for lawyers. This is a book that explains what the legal requirements, how to manage the law within the context of being about to embark on a demining project, for example. So using our skills as lawyers to fill that gap between the legal structure and enforcement. So what's the end goal? I mean, what might we see as a, I'm often asked to say, well, what is my mark of success? How can I show that I've achieved something? And I take this, I show it to all my students here in my course at Surrey. And I think one of the best end goals is set out in an action program written by, for the Environment Secretariat of the European Union. There's a number of action programs. This is the 7th action program, and it talks about 2050. We often have as a target some year in the future. I sometimes wonder if the science fiction's back there again, but a target for 20 years ahead, 30 years ahead. And 2050 seems to be a favorite date, so 30 years away. And I was saying to my students last week when I also gave them this, this end goal, in 30 years time, for you young students listening, this is your world. 30 years, it'll be down to you. It's down to me at the moment. My generation have not done a great job as a human species, but the next 30 years, well, how are you going to leave the world? And this is what the European Union aims for as an end goal in their Living Well Within the Limits of Our Planet action program. And I'll just read it to you. In 2050, 30 years hence, we live well within the planet's ecological limits. Our prosperity and healthy environment stem from an innovative circular economy where nothing is wasted and where natural resources are managed sustainably. And biodiversity is protected, valued, and restored in ways that enhance our society's resilience. Our low carbon growth has long been decoupled from resource use, setting the pace for a safe and sustainable global future. So if that's an end goal, in 30 years' time, when it's your world, think about me and ask yourselves, did I actually do what Rosalind said we should be doing? Did we make it? Have we done it? And it's your chance. It's over to you for the next 30 years. And finally, why are we doing it? Why value the planet? Just the sheer beauty of the planet is worth preserving. Above all else, I think. Just think about the sheer beauty of it and watch some of those rather wonderful David Attenborough shows. Well, that's me done. I'm happy to take any questions. Or you have my contact details there. If you wish to get in touch with me later on, you'll be most welcome. So thank you, Taco.
Okay. Yes, thank you for an insightful talk. Locating lawyers within these debates. I particularly like this responsibility that you place on us as individuals, because this goes beyond lawyering and what our professional responsibilities are. I think there is a chance here to do something for ourselves, and as lawyers, perhaps we have an opportunity to make sure that we contribute to how legal policy, at least in relation to the environment, is structured and how that is implemented. Now I'm looking on the chat and there are no questions there, and I wonder whether that's because we are hitting lunch here, but also in many other places around the world. But perhaps if you could comment a little bit on your role as a barrister and how you see that contributing to work in environmental law. Because for me, the most interesting part of your profile is the fact that you are a court-going barrister and involved in all these cases. And I mean, how do you see litigation and your role as counsel in matters related to the environment?
I think it's one tool. I think it's one way in which we can achieve change and improve the environment, and it can be done at in many different ways. There's the headlines seizing court cases, and then there's the daily grind of court work where you're bringing quite small, quite low-level prosecutions, for example, acting for environmental bodies. Bringing actions that don't grab the headlines, and yet they are critical in terms of ensuring environmental protection. So there's a whole range of it, really, and it is one tool, and it's education, training, writing, talking. These are all different tools within the whole toolbox of ways in which we, as lawyers, can make our contribution. Okay. I think Godfrey had his hand. Godfrey had his hand up.
Okay, please.
Did Godfrey have a question?
Your mic is off, Godfrey.
Okay, no, I just wanted to applaud that. I really understand the role of lawyers in environmental law and solving the environmental problems.
Okay. I hope that I've sparked your ambition to be activist lawyers in whatever particular capacity you find yourselves in the future.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and there's another question from Daniel, and I think it relates to your comments about court practice and environmental litigation, and he asks whether climate change litigation is particularly difficult to litigate due to scientific evidence that may not be 100% certain. How should lawyers or judges deal with these challenges during litigation?
That's a really good point. It's like the same question about the precautionary principle. How can you enforce the precautionary principle when you can't show that on the balance of probabilities this is going to happen? I think that the answer lies very much in the sort of litigation that is taking place, that is being successful. If you're looking at national laws which are dealing with things like atmospheric emissions, that are highly technical laws, quite boring laws, you know, they say your emissions mustn't be above X amount, or your contamination of water mustn't be above a certain amount, or certain things mustn't be in that. In other words, where you've actually got a national law that translates climate change into specifics. It's about specific law. And I'm a great believer in that you start with a concept at international level. So it might be, you know, a right to sanitation, for example, but you need the laws at ground level to actually be detailed and specific and require, I mean, if I can use the sanitation example, you know, to require that sanitary facilities must be installed for so many groups of people, that you mustn't have shared use above a certain number, that you must have toilets of certain design. In other words, you reduce it to quite detailed technical criteria. And then, of course, it is easy to litigate because you either do comply or you don't comply. You've got very clear issues about compliance and causality and so on. Take the litigation, and this is worldwide, monumental litigation against Volkswagen. I mentioned the German case. I think litigation is taking place in practically every country in the world. And that's climate change litigation because it's about atmospheric emissions. One of the biggest causes in many of our countries of unclean air, polluted air, is our emissions from transport. And we control that by saying each car, each vehicle mustn't emit above a certain amount. And then you can easily litigate where there's been a failure to comply with that. And in the Volkswagen litigation, you've not only got a failure to comply, you've got what is essentially a fraud occurring, where people have defrauded the operational systems which test emissions and so on. So then litigation is relatively, litigation's never straightforward, I shouldn't really suggest that, but you know, in terms of the question that Daniel asks, it becomes relatively straightforward to deal with because you've got a clear, specific set of laws and you've got compliance or failure to comply. And I think that that's the way forward in terms of climate change litigation, that we need to cascade international law into national law, and then we need to enforce it.
Okay, thank you. I see Isabel has her hand up. Isabel, could you please ask your question?
Is it still up? I thought I put it down. But anyway, I had kind of like a more personal question for Rosalind. Since I'm more of the younger generation, for example, the fast fashion trend that is going on in my generation, when I go on Instagram, there's always a new trend, new pants, anything that's new that everyone wants to have. So sometimes, I don't know, I think my generation has really a problem to deal with this topic, especially when we see so many people with new things, new trends. There are the Kardashians and this you know, this capitalism and to consume things, to have a lot of things, and that this is the only way that we will be happy. So I don't know if you have any advice for like my generation, for us, how to deal with these things, how to deal with also with the power of social media to be better, to be activists.
Well, yeah, a great question. It is really difficult, and it is difficult to resist. I touched upon it earlier, you know, this huge addiction that we have to buying stuff. We are easily seduced. We are incredibly weak about it. So there's a personal message, resist, don't buy new, don't buy stuff. And I know how hard that is. I'm sorry, I fail over and over again. As a lawyer, I'm looking at eco-design here. And I think that, you know, the whole eco-design of products is a way forward for this, that no product should be allowed on the market unless the producer, the manufacturer, the designer can show how that can be reused in the future, that it will, you know, the obsolescence question, that it won't wear out, it will last, that it can be upcycled at some point. I mean, we don't really expect to have the same object. Technological change sweeps the past away, doesn't it? But we should be able to make objects that can be rebuilt, remade, reused, that we don't just throw into an incinerator and think we've done quite well because we've converted it into energy. So it's about hitting at the design stage and using the law to hit at that stage. So you know, I have a slogan, and I've given a list of references at the end of my slides. There's an article I wrote about a new model law for products that I'm working on at the moment. I fancifully call it a codex rerum, that we need to have a law about things, about stuff, if you like to use that expression, that we need to ensure that there is, if there's no sustainability impact assessment, there's no market. Don't let it get on the market.
I just feel like the big brands, I don't know, when I go shopping, I live in Berlin, so when I go shopping, I don't know which brand is sustainable. If I go buy a Nike or Adidas, what is the policy there? I just don't know. So yeah, I think the reaction from us is we don't know, so we buy it anyway because there's no bad news or anything about it. Or you're more like, well, I don't know anything about it, so I'll buy somewhere else. But the big brands, I think they're just not transparent enough. So
I have this debate with my colleague psychologists who say the answer lies in changing behavior, changing your behavior, and it lies in giving knowledge about it and consumer information. I agree with that up to a point, but my argument is we take the non-sustainable products off the market. We make them illegal. That we do not allow them on the market because they haven't gone through an impact assessment of their effect on the environment, which includes climate change and the rest of it. So I would hit it two ways. I would give consumer information, but I would also back it up with law. And the fact is, this is not a terribly radical idea. You cannot buy a new fridge or heater or you know, that kind of equipment that hasn't gone through this kind of eco-design approach at the moment. We are working quite effectively in the European Union to ensure that these products that consume energy must have satisfied technical assessment of whether they are, you know, environmentally friendly, if I can use that dreadful term. And my argument is we need to extend that to all products. That's the radical bit of my approach, that we extend it to all products, your clothes, the stuff you buy, everything.
Okay, thank you, Rosalind. Thanks for your time this morning. We really appreciate you for joining us. I'm going to take some time now to respond to some of the questions that were raised at the end of my talk. I'll take maybe 5 minutes and then we can have a lunch break before we start again at quarter past 1. So again, thank you, and Noreen as well. Thanks for joining us.